thank you all again for being here today. And without further ado, I will pass it along to Pavel and Paul. Thank you.
Good morning. Thank you, Misa, for that introduction. And again, I have to convey my thanks to you and the CAM team for embracing this exhibition and making it look so incredible in the galleries here. So Paul and I, this is the second time that Paul and I have been in a public conversation. The first time was at his gallery in New York, and I sent him questions in advance then. This time I didn't. And I'll start with easy questions, but they will just get harder, because this is the last time, I guess, on occasion of this show, that we get to speak together. Although right before I came up, Paul said to me, he leaned in and he said, "You'll never get rid of me." So maybe there'll be another conversation in the future. Some of you may have seen the show already, but I think we could maybe start first by talking about just generally introducing the exhibition for those who haven't really spent time in it yet. This is a show that charts work that was made from the moment when you essentially stopped making work in 2009 and took a breather. Founded the publishing press, Badlands Unlimited, and then slowly over the course of 2010 and 11, you came back to making art. And maybe, Paul, you could start by talking about why taking a breather was so important to you at that moment.
Sure. Can people, oh geez, people can hear me? Okay, great. It's great to be here with you. I'm never leaving your life. I reached peak screen. So, you know, I think if people knew me at all as an artist early on in the early to mid 2000s, it was through my video work, video installations, video projections, and what was being projected were animations that I drew by hand on a computer for hours. And for anyone who's done animation, you know that you would spend anywhere from 24, 36, 48 hours staring at a computer to draw something, to make it move. And at the end of that process, you may get 2 seconds, maybe 3. That's the kind of the ratio. And so it took a lot of energy and time to animate, as any animator knows. So I spent a lot of time staring at a screen. I was making work that was projected from videos. I was looking at monitors. Video works were coming into their own in the early to mid 2000s. And then at a certain point, the iPhone came. You know, smartphones had been in the offing for a while, but it wasn't until the iPhone, which was around 2007, 2008, that it really came and became very popular for people. And it struck me that they were robust enough even then that we would be looking at video on our phones soon. We would do everything looking at this tiny screen. And I was overcome with a sense of dread that I realized I would never escape the screen. I made work for screens. I looked at screens in exhibitions. And now I was carrying a screen in my pocket that allowed what I had imagined to be full-range video. Not to speak of video projector technologies that allowed projections to be on the sides of buildings with the kind of clarity and form that we would expect on a monitor. So I would say that I entered into a spiral of depression, thinking that I could see myself in the future being entombed by screens. And I think that was a point when I realized I had to make a decision. And I loved making that work. You know, I'm very proud of it. But I think the moment for that work was over for me because I realized I got no pleasure from looking at my own work and the work of others. And so the question is, what do you do? I didn't have the answer then. So the second best answer is that I would walk away. And I think that was what I did. I just walked away.
This exhibition brings together works from Badlands onwards, and I'm curious, how has reassessing this period of 2009 to today, how has that recast or somehow What have you learned from that? How has it changed your perception of the earlier work, of the pre-2009 work?
I think it's a great question. I think the most obvious for me is the realization that the earlier animations had nothing to do with what I drew. It had everything to do with how it moved. So of course, I was attracted to certain themes and ideas and images. The Henry Darger's girls, shadows, movement of clouds. But it wasn't necessarily those things. It was the movement that those things elicited and the feelings that I got from them. And so coming to making these peculiar works was really an acknowledgement that it was the movement that mattered more than the content. The movement was the content. The movement was what gave me the shape of a thing for me to remember and to me to, in a way, memorialize. So I think that's the first thing. Also, I think even in the video work, the earlier video work didn't necessarily exist on a simple wall. I made video work that was projected on the floor, so it looked like a shadow being cast from a window from afternoon light in your kitchen, for instance, right? So I always chafed at the idea of having to work with a screen, with the frame, with a rectangular frame. And so to me, I already had the seeds of a kind of acknowledgement that I needed a full-bodied experience, because the floor projections you can walk over. And in fact, for me, to really experience those early floor projections, you had to walk around them. You might even have to be in them. And if you were to find yourself in them, and most times it's children who do that. Adults are too polite, so they think you shouldn't touch the work because we've been told not to. But that's ridiculous. I shouldn't say that. The registrar is here. It's not, I don't mean that. I mean that metaphorically. But you can feel something when projected light is on your skin. I can. In the same way that sometimes we feel the temperature change when a cloud goes over us, even though we may not be able to see it, right? You can just feel that 0.5 degree difference in heat from the sun going over you, right? And you know, you don't even have to see the cloud to know that that's what it is. I get that same feeling when a plane goes over you. You ever have that feeling of a plane going over you? You don't hear it, you don't see it, but you just feel that movement, that change in temperature, and you know. So we see by feeling as much as we see by seeing. And I think my sense of video at its best has always been that. But at a certain point, it wasn't enough. I needed something else.
I'm struck there's something almost, I think as curators and viewers of art, we tend to want to neatly summarize what a work does, and a lot of people talk about your pre-2009 in relation to its engagement with politics or America at the time. But the way that you describe it, there's something almost impressionist about the way that you're driven towards wanting to make a work that is a testament to a particular movement or feeling. And I want to connect that to the Breathers, because you describe these works as wanting to give shape to a particular movement that you've observed. So could you maybe talk a little bit about the Breathers and how they don't necessarily start with a predetermined form, but rather with a sense of movement that you then work with Harrison to then create a work that speaks to that movement?
I like this thread of conversation because I have to then confess about my vanity. And it's related to my vanity because I'm nearsighted. I don't wear my glasses. I was diagnosed with I'm just nearsighted. I need glasses. And I've known that since I was 12. And when I got my glasses, I put them on, and I took them off right away. I didn't like how I looked. And I would never wear them. I just put them in the wherever. I would lose them intentionally, so I wouldn't wear them. And I got in trouble because I couldn't see. I couldn't see the blackboard. I couldn't see my friends. But I was stubborn. I didn't want to look bad. I'm vain. Over time, though, because I was stubborn, I adapted so that I could recognize things based on their movement. Human beings are incredibly adaptable when we have our sensory capacities full and ready. And so I've adapted to be able to see based on a person's movement. So I'd like to think I wouldn't have to see your face down the street in order to know you're there. I feel like I know you well enough to see you by the way you walk, by the way you move. And I think that's generally the case. I think I won't go into the esoteric and so boring philosophical dominance of visuality in Western culture. I'll save that for another day. But I think a common experience we have is that we see more than with our eyes. And I certainly know that. I see more movement. And so these breathers are really my way of memorializing movement I care to remember, or I have found vivid enough to recall. And that to me is as much of a portrait of a moment or of a person or of a situation than anything else, anything I can draw. So, and I think and I know work is right somehow because the peripheral vision is alive. I know that through video work. I know that through the breathers. So.
You had mentioned earlier this notion of peak screen, but I think also the show has to do with burnout and not finding joy anymore in the way that you work. And many of the utopian socialists were really important to you, continue to be important to you, and I really love this quote from Charles Fourier, who's a figure that you keep returning to, and he says, "The radical evil of our industrial system is the employment of the laborer in a single occupation, which runs the risk of coming to a standstill." Can you talk a little bit about how that sits in relation to walking away and wanting to recast and remake the work and yourself as a worker?
Pavel, this is hard because once you bring up Charles Fourier, I will only talk about him, and it's over now. I'm going to give you like a 6-hour conversation. You might as well get a snack now.
I'll help you pivot.
Because I'm not going to stop.
I have page 2. I'll help you pivot.
Charles Fourier believed that in a utopia, we should be able to do anything we want, but only for 2 hours. Charles Fourier is arguably the first and arguably only philosopher I'm aware of who systematized pastries as a metaphor for his thought. No one has written so eloquently and so succinctly about justice, pleasure, and croissants than Charles Fourier, which is very French, right? But he was a libertine. Libertines have an edge to them, which I think comes from their underdeveloped notion of eros. Fourier's notion of eros is connected to a much more multidimensional sense of what pleasure is. So he knew and talked about the pleasure of eating, the pleasure of seeing, the pleasure of touch. He's the only one I'm aware of, and maybe there are scholars in the room, he's the only one I'm aware of who really created a system, a hierarchy of orgies. And it had nothing to do with sex. He had museum orgies where people would get together to go to many, many museums to be enthralled with what they're looking at, but only for 2 hours. Right? He would create cantons of competition based on foods and what you can make. Charles Fourier is arguably the philosopher that Marx stole from for Marx's understanding what a union is. Because Fourier was arguably the first person to talk about how potato farmers should get together to control their prices, to not be screwed by the people paying for the potatoes. I find Charles Fourier absolutely profound. And I think in a way Marx took a lot of Fourier ideas, but left behind the sensuous stuff. Like that Marx wasn't interested in the beauty of a wallpaper. Marx couldn't use how Fourier talked about the delicacy of the turbot fish as a semblance of what it means to live a good life. I'm not really into turbot, I like catfish, but I loved Fourier. I'm sorry, what was the question? Also, the book to read for Charles Fourier is called A Theory of the Four Movements. It's put out by Cambridge. It's still, I think, in print. It's kind of boring, but you just got to give it time. Because Fourier, see, it's not going to stop. Fourier was he was really into numbers. You know, in the 18th, 17th century, math was coming into its own, and philosophy was trying to take in mathematical concepts in a way. So the encyclopedias like Diderot, Voltaire, the encyclopedias were really into numbers, naming things, numbering things, right? So Fourier had real numerological systems of understanding his philosophy, which really comes down to what it means to live a good life and have your full sensory capacities to be able to enjoy it. Because if you don't enjoy it, you'll lose it, and you won't have the kind of vigilance you need to know what's truly not enjoyable.
So my question...
I'm sorry, and then there... Just kidding.
No, but that is the point of the question, which is that for Fourier, the notion of pleasure was supposed to guide work. That through pleasure we would discover what gives us fulfillment in terms of work. And so for him, he was talking about how the system that we're living in forces us to work within a single occupation. And I think what's interesting about the breather and moving away and starting Badlands is this: you were contesting with, let's say, a box that you were put into. And so I'm curious, you know, if you could talk a little bit about how that still resonates for you in terms of a kind of perennial rethinking of what gives you joy in your work and how you can keep growing as you make things and work today.
Fourier only published one book. I'm just kidding. I thought I was going to keep going. I think what I love about making the breathers is that I feel like I need all of my sensory capacities to do it. I think I have lots of pet theories, but one of my pet theories is that when we feel deprived, when we feel tired, one of the reasons is that our sensory capacities are being deprived. That when I talk about our senses, we typically think of the Aristotelian senses, the five senses: seeing, smelling, tasting, touching, hearing. But we have many more senses than that. And I don't mean that in a kind of crystal, Sedona, mystical, dream catcher sense. Medically speaking, scientifically speaking, we have a suite of senses within us called interoception. And those sensory capacities allow us to understand what's happening inside us, like our heart rate. Cardioception is a acknowledged standard medical scientific term for our ability to understand our own heart rate. There are some people who can't feel their own heartbeat, right? There's a spectrum of autistic people who cannot feel their own heart rate. Cardioception is a sense, in the same way that smelling is a sense. Proprioception is our sense of being able to tell where our hands and limbs are without actually seeing them. That's a sense. There's a suite of intestinal senses that allow us to tell us whether we have toxins. Our understanding of our oxygen level is a sense. All these things tell us what's happening inside us. So my pet theory, not being a medical person, being a nobody really, is that when we feel fulfilled, when we feel energized, all of our sensory capacities are at full. And they're working in coordination to understand what is most real and what is worth paying attention to, right? Like when we meet someone, it's not just that what they say matters, it's how they feel to us matters. So we're picking up on things not only for their gestures, but maybe their smell, maybe how they move. And those things register not only with our Aristotelian senses, but it's coordinated and correlated with how our heart rate, our oxygen level, right? Our intestinal health. All those things contribute to us being able to understand the moment that we're meeting. And when we can't meet that moment because we're too tired or sad or angry or depressed or in despair, I think our sensory capacities are being somehow deprived, or that we can't trust them. And the only way to me, be able to do that is to renew, to accept that for what it is. That we have these sensory capacities that we need to understand what's real and what's not, and that we need them to be vigilant about what matters and what doesn't, what hurts and what doesn't, and what pleases us and what doesn't, right? I think, to me, Fourier's sort of cornucopian philosophy is related to that. Like, he believed that all of the senses should be fulfilled. Not just one, not just two, all of them. And he made room for it, right? And I feel like the breathers help me make room for that. Because you just don't, to me, you don't just look at the breathers, you feel them. I feel the air moving. I feel the movement. I have to walk around them. I take them in ways that are much more than Aristotelian. And I love Aristotle. Do I love Aristotle? He's okay.
Not as much as Fourier.
Not as much as Fourier. Although Aristotle wrote this great book called Problemata. Aristotle wrote a book almost like a Q&A, like an FAQ of all his medical insights. And so Problemata is a little-known Aristotelian work, and it's cut up in sections, and one section is called sweating. So he answers all questions about sweating. Like, why do I sweat walking up a hill? Why do I sweat drinking undiluted wine as opposed to diluted wine? And he goes into it. He's like, well, this is why you got it. And it's really fun to read.
We have about 10 minutes before we open up to questions. And I do want to get to some juicy questions. But first, I want to pick up on what you were
Charles
saying.
Fourier is the juicy question. Museum orgy? Come on.
That's just part
Lisa.
one.
Museum orgy. Maybe you can spell it wrong so it doesn't, people don't think it's orgy. It's orge. Museum orge.
I want to pick up on what you were talking about in terms of renewal. And one of the kind of ways in which you've talked about renewal is through the motif of the bather and bathing. And you curated a show at the Guggenheim that spoke to this particular motif in their collection. Many of the breathers are also bathers. And I just want to recall something that you said when you were describing the bathers, which is that you were thinking about them in relation to renewal, rejuvenation, but also how do we renew ourselves to meet what the day demands? Can you talk a little bit about how that motif of the bather has come into your work?
Ghostface is the work on the wall. Looks like Harry Potter Death Eater, Spectre of Death. That work functions on an 18-inch fan, bigger, more powerful. Movement is more aggressive, perhaps angrier. The works, the breathers on the floor are on 14-inch fans, smaller, less air pressure. Movement is more languid, slower. And so the bathers are really the 14-inch fan works that move more slowly, languidly. Maybe at the scale, more human scale than a other human scale. And I wanted to make smaller. I first made the bigger breathers, 18-inch fans. I was angry. I wanted an impact in a way. But then I wanted to lessen the impact, use smaller fans, more languid movements. And I was looking for a kind of theme or looking for an idea to help me think about it. And the bathers motif in art history came to mind. And I looked into it. I'm not really a bather. I'm not really a swimmer. It's the asthma. That's such an excuse. They're asthmatic swimmers. Just a coward, really, I think. But I looked into it, and I loved thinking about bathers in art history. Because if you look at bathers in art history and paintings, no one is ever in pain. No one looks like they're in distress. They all just look like they're just trying to enjoy the day with each other. Sometimes they're naked, sometimes they're not. They're in nature. They're just sort of themselves, unadorned in a way, right? Unimpressed, unadorned. I also, at the time, I was publishing a book by the great painter Carol Dunham. I love Carol Dunham. I think he's one of the best living painters alive. And he was doing a bathers series, or he did a bathers series, and I love them. They're so strange. Tip, friends call him Tip. He's such a strange painter, but just remarkable. No one paints like Tip. And I really appreciated how he painted bathers. And I liked the idea of reinventing this motif, which I thought was in the past. It's not in the past for me. And so that's part of it. It's a sense of making something that feels unadorned and just enjoying the day. I also love making clothes for bathers. Harrison Collins, who works at my studio, he's a designer, he's a fashion designer, and he sews a lot of stuff for me. The most pleasure we get in the studio is making swimwear for non-human forms. Some of the bathers in there have clothes on, like bikinis and mesh shirts, and we love it. I love designing swimwear for alien life forms. Like, we talked about how we don't even know what's being covered up. Like, what is a bikini for a non-human form? Like, what are the combinations that would allow a non-human form to look erotic, appealing, right? Like, and it's weird because it can be a real turn on. And I just stare at it. I just said that. Is this being recorded? Oh, good. He's saying no. So.
I want to end with a question, which is that I think, the work behind us, this incredible mural that is a drawing based on the word strolling, which appears to be drawn by a child because you're using your non-dominant left hand, and it's this incredible work where we have couples walking through a landscape of destruction and of terrible things happening. And I'm really struck by how this really just makes me think about where we are today in the world. But one thing that I always pick up on when I read what you've written and read interviews with you is that you have a kind of a deep love for art. And in one interview, you said, "There is something about a work that moves me, that neither critiques or makes a fetish out of the materials around it or out of the times in which it exists. And yet it nevertheless performs something, and I want to make that kind of work." So my question for you, given the times that we're in, is what is the promise of art?
There's a short answer and a long one. Which one do you want?
Somewhere in the middle?
You know, the writer Stendhal was the one who said, art is the promise of happiness. Promise de bonheur. So that's a short one. I don't know. I don't know, man. I kind of know. Do I know? I know, you know, Barnett Newman said he wanted to paint something that he can look at. I don't know if that's true for me. Maybe what's truer is that I want to make something that helps me feel like I'm not wasting my time on Earth. I always feel like, I always say I was just marooned on this planet. I like the feeling of being an alien. I'm just marooned here. I don't belong here. I'm just trying to make the best of it. And that's the truth. So what does that mean, to try to make the best of it? So I think what that means is that I try to take seriously all of my sensory capacities. I take seriously the notion that no one does it on their own. I take seriously the idea that I have to protect my attention as if my life depends on it, so that I can focus on what I think will give me the kind of feelings of ecstasy and compassion that Rumi talks about, the great Persian poet. I think that fits me. It suits me. It's a kind of clothing I want to wear. And I think this mural is a semblance of that. Whether it fits other people, I don't know. But I'll tell you, the time spent making it, the time thinking about it, was worth it. Even if it looks terrible, even if no one likes it, even if people say, this is the worst thing you've made, I enjoyed every moment of it. And knowing that that moment has come once means that it can come again. And maybe that's what matters most to me. I feel that way about the breathers. I feel that way about people. So.
Thank you for that. That's a beautiful, honest, and I think reaffirming answer and way to conclude our conversation and open up for questions.
That was fun. Can we talk about Trans World?
I'm just going to let you go. Hi, Paul. Welcome to CAM. Thanks for being here.
Thank you.
Could you take us a little bit through the process leading up to your work? You know, what does sketching look like to you? And I know it probably varies based upon the different works here, but you know, like your ink on paper works. Are there studies and sketches, or is this the genesis of the work? And you know, kind of what does that lead up? What does the build-up process look like for you?
Sure. I think for the drawings, they're definitely sketches. For this one, for instance, the first version of this was this long. And then the second version was 3 times as long. And then the third version are 8 sheets of paper in my studio that I drew. That is 8 feet tall by 36 feet wide. And then that became the basis for Scott doing the mural. Where's Scott? Scott's right there. Scott's the artist who did the mural based on my drawing. Thank you, Scott. For the breathers, it's the muslin models that you see on the wall, made of the rough canvas material. I draw the pattern, and then typically Harrison sews it, and then we stuff it like a stuffed animal. And then once I like the shape, I then draw a new version that's full size, and then Harrison sews the ripstock nylon version, and we strap it on the fan to try to test out the movement I have in mind. And 100% of the time, it doesn't work. And so we do it again and again and again. So it's a real iterative process until I get the movement right. With the breathers, sometimes it takes up to 30 to 40 iterations to get it right. So.
You mentioned for the breathers, this is loud enough, yeah. For the breathers that you sense people based on their walk, do you see a connection with animals, like dogs especially, that use other senses that we don't usually use for perceiving people?
Yeah, you know, we're animals. And so it just so happens that us animals as humans prioritize certain sensory capacities over others. Other animals have sensory capacities that are much more attenuated. Like, for instance, as far as I know, dogs smell in 4 dimensions. They can smell, they can remember smell over time. Their sense of smell is similar to the perceptivity of our eyes. And so they really see the world through sense. I think Oliver Sacks, the great neurologist and writer, have talked about the differing sensory capacities of people, who we might think of as other-abled and other-minded, especially people on the autism spectrum. You know, he's written about people with perfect memory, even though they're blind. They've talked about people who are blind who uses echolocation. Literally, they've either trained or intuited a sense of the world through a finer discernment of sound, so they can walk just by hearing things. So I'm super into isn't even the right word. I look at sensory capacities as if my life depends on it, because I think it does.
There's a question here in the front.
How do you balance work and pleasure in, I guess, thinking about avoiding burnout?
I don't have a real job. My job is making work. And when work feels like work, I walk away. I mean, that was my story in 2008 when I was making video work, and I had a real life. I had a real career. And, but it was killing me. And so, you know, it's not for everyone to walk away, but I'm not good at being in pain. I'm not good at being in pain. And I'd rather walk away. I'm willing to lose. And I don't know where that comes from. Probably my mom. But losing never feels like a loss to me. And so I feel like honing a capacity to lose helps me walk away. Because if I'm willing to lose, that means I'm also willing to see other opportunities, right? Because to me, a carrot is a stick. You know what I mean? And I learned that through people who cared for me and Samuel Beckett. That's who I learned it from.
When you walked away, do you think in the moment you had decided to walk away, or is that sort of a retrospective notion that it feels like you were walking away right now, but maybe back then you were less intentional about it?
No, I was pretty intentional. I told the gallery I wasn't going to make any new work. I told them that I'm happy to help them install work that's already been done, but they shouldn't expect a new show from me. And they should decline all invitations for new work from anywhere in perpetuity. I was pretty intentional. I stopped hiring people to work for me. I had like 2 people. I just cleaned my studio for like 2 years. I had money saved up, but I lived pretty frugally. So it's not like it scared me. And also, the life of an artist is great, but I've done jobs before. I can design a website. I can clean a house. You know, I don't need the imprimatur of being an artist to survive. I just needed my full sensory capacities to give myself time. So.
I would love for you to speak more about the bodega reimagining setup. I'm a sexuality educator, and so I love seeing queerness in museums. So if you could speak a little bit more about the intentionality behind the specific words, posters, what like your favorite, I'm looking over it now on my phone, well, like what your favorite sign was. Mine was dildos, etc., obviously. But yeah, and maybe even how like New York or yeah, how New York has shaped your political activism through art.
I don't know if New York has changed my activism. I love kids. I love hearing them. There's a philosopher who said every child is the face of goodness, and I believe him. He had really strange philosophy about death, which is weird. The signs that you're talking about is based on an installation of works from Badlands Unlimited, my press. And the signs specifically were made for protesters. So when the Million Women's March came up in New York and DC, Friends needed signs to bring to the protest. So I thought I would make them. And at the time, I was really, I thought about the Westboro Baptist Church, where the aesthetic comes from. For those of you who may or may not know, Westboro Baptist Church is a family church who protests at funerals of gay people and others. They're pioneers of Christian hate speech. They make signs that says, "God hates your dead gay son." And I wanted to, and they're very graphically like the signs that you see there. So I wanted to just take that aesthetic and just use it. So that's what I did. I took it. It reminds me slightly of, I don't know if it's true, but what I did, I think of Richard Prince, actually. For those of you who know Richard Prince, he's an artist who appropriated the Marlboro Man as his own art. And so he would recreate the Marlboro Man for his artwork. The Marlboro Man is the icon for the Marlboro cigarette company. And whatever you may think about Richard Prince, I thought that was the most progressive things ever done. So, because now, when you look at a Marlboro Man, you don't necessarily think of the Marlboro cigarette company. You think of Richard Prince. So he has basically stolen a corporate logo and sort of recirculated it as something else. And I find that profoundly progressive. So I feel like part of my intention to stealing the Westboro Baptist Church's sign is to make it so ubiquitous that no one remembers them, that they only remember my signs, where it says, "God hates Trump," or "Eat ass, pray love," right? So that, I don't know if it worked, but we gave it a shot. So we made hundreds of them, all different ones. So what you see is just a small sample of them. And I think, and that was the motivation. I think sexual politics is important to me, and it's also fun. And I think it goes to the heart of what I've been talking about renewal and fulfillment through being honest about all of our sensory capacities. And eros and sexuality is a part of that. When it isn't a part of you, you're being sensory deprived. And I'm not saying you should have sex, but I'm saying the acknowledgement that you are a sexual person is an acknowledgement of a certain domain of sensory capacities you have that you must be vigilant of and take care of. Because if you don't, you're being deprived.
I think we have time for maybe one more question. I think another dimension to add to that is that when the signs were made, they were sold, and the proceeds were given to various charitable causes, which I think is an important part of that project too.
It was ACLU, Planned Parenthood, Black and Pink, which is an LGBTQ plus advocacy group for prisoners of color, and the Ida B. Wells Society, which tried to get more journalists of color into newsrooms. Those were the 4 groups. Hi.
Hi. So my question is actually more of a comment and wondering about your reaction to it. I have so enjoyed your talk. And one of the things I've particularly enjoyed about it is the way you have paused and thought about each of the questions and valued them before you answered. And that gave me such a nice feeling. And I wonder if you have any comment about that.
What's your name?
Bill.
I appreciate that a lot. Thank you. I'm slow-minded, so I need time to think. That might be the easiest answer. I also think things take time. And I think one of the genuine pleasures of being alive is to be able to meet a moment, whatever that moment is, right? Like as you're saying what you said to me, I'm trying to take it in. And the longer I give myself time to take it in, the more chances I have of finding the words that will matter. At least to me, if not to you. And the best of art, I think, gives us that room. It doesn't necessarily tell us what to think, but it gives us time to feel the coursing through our body if we are sensitive enough to it. So that maybe we'll find the right words. Or maybe it's not even the words. But at the very least, we don't need an answer right away. Because I feel like the sense of needing to answer right away, to react right away, to get something right away, is half a degree away from fascism.
Please join me in thanking Paul.